The Savannah sun was a physical weight, pressing the humid air into my lungs like a damp towel. I stood by the open grave, my black dress sticking to the sweat on my spine, as I buried my 8-year-old son alone. Across town, my family toasted with champagne, celebrating the $1,500,000 they planned to use for my sister's fresh start. What I did next will haunt them forever. I looked toward the gate, but the gravel remained silent. No cars arrived. The silence of the cemetery was absolute until a vibration thrummed against my thigh. My heart leaped, a foolish spark of hope, imagining an apology or a late arrival. I pulled the phone from my purse with shaking fingers. It was a notification from my mother, but it contained no words of comfort. It was a Zillow link for a sprawling 5-bedroom coastal estate. The price tag matched the life insurance and trust fund total exactly. They were shopping while I was burying. The first shovel of dirt hit the wooden casket with a hollow, final thud. That sound should have broken me, but it acted like a circuit breaker instead. I looked at the screen again, my vision sharpening through the blur of heat and salt. They had calculated John's worth before his heart even stopped beating. My mother's caption read, "Fresh start." As if my son was merely a line item in their budget, the dirt kept falling, burying my old self too. I drove home with the air conditioning blasting against my skin, the scent of white lilies cloying and thick in the back seat. The flowers were beautiful, but they felt like a funeral parlor trap. I walked into my kitchen and stared at the empty chair, where John used to eat his cereal. I expected the grief to buckle my knees and swallow the room. Instead, a strange, icy clarity climbed my spine. Everything in the apartment suddenly looked high, definition and dangerously hard, edged. I opened my laptop and logged into the florist's website, using my mother's saved password. My hands were steady as I scrolled through the order history. There it was. A date stamp from 14 days ago. They had ordered the funeral sprays 2 weeks before the service even happened. They hadn't missed the burial because of traffic or a delayed flight. They had scheduled their absence like a dentist appointment. The last thread of my childish hope finally snapped for good. I navigated to the banking portal with a focused, predatory calm. My sister, Destiny, was still listed as an authorized user on my secondary credit card. I scrolled through her recent transactions while I had been writing the eulogy. She had spent $400 at Sephora and $200 more at a sushi restaurant. I clicked the button to remove her access and watched the confirmation flash. The digital ties were being cut. They thought I was soft, but I was becoming diamond. I opened a spreadsheet hidden deep in my hard drive. I called it the ledger. For years, I had tracked every cent drained by my family. Row 1 showed $96,000 for their second mortgage. I remembered my mother, Amber, sobbing about losing their home. I felt guilty back then because my career as a botanical illustrator was finally taking off. I paid without question. My father, Andrew, didn't say thank you. He just noted that I was finally being useful. Row 12 listed Destiny's influencer trip to Tulum. She claimed she needed a break to build her brand. My mother cornered me at Sunday dinner, calling me selfish for having savings. I paid for the flight and the hotel. Destiny posted 30 photos of herself on the beach. I wasn't tagged once. Looking at the cold numbers now, the addiction to their approval broke. They used my guilt like a weapon to keep their own pockets full. My eyes landed on a recent entry from 2 days ago. A package had arrived at my door with a note from Amber. It said she sent something to help me through the grief. I expected a photo album or a blanket. Instead, the box contained a stack of past, due credit card bills and foreclosure notices. A yellow sticky note was attached to the top. It said to do the right thing because family helps family. They sent me invoices. The shame that had defined my life for 30 years evaporated instantly. It was replaced by a concentrated fuel. I had spent my life building a safety net for people who only viewed me as an inheritance. They didn't see a grieving mother in this apartment. They saw a payout from John's trust fund. I closed the laptop and sat in the dark. The silence didn't feel heavy anymore. It felt like a war room before a strike. The banging on my door started at 2 in the afternoon. It was the heavy, entitled pounding of people who believed they owned the building. I checked the peephole and saw Andrew and Amber standing there. I unlocked the deadbolt. My father pushed past me immediately, letting the Savannah heat roll into the hallway. He walked straight to my refrigerator and began pulling out cartons. He tossed a bag of spinach into the trash while muttering about it being wilted. My mother stood in the hallway staring at my botanical illustrations. She said the drawings looked obsessive and dark. She claimed I was spiraling and that the apartment was too quiet. I leaned against the door frame and asked what they wanted. Amber reached into her designer handbag and pulled out a thick document. She placed it on the coffee table with a rehearsed, fragile smile. It was a voluntary conservatorship. They wanted total control of my finances. Andrew slammed the refrigerator door shut and glared at me. He said they had already spoken to a specialist about my psychotic break. If I didn't sign the papers, they would call the authorities for a forced psychiatric hold. He claimed they had neighbor statements and forged emails to prove I was a danger to myself. I looked past them toward the street. Destiny was sitting in her car, filming the front door for her growing online audience. I stared at the ring light reflecting in Destiny's car window. My sister was monetizing my son's death, while my parents stood in my kitchen threatening my freedom. The sheer coldness of their plan made my skin crawl. They needed my signature to access John's trust fund, before the creditors closed in on them. Amber stepped closer and touched my cheek with a hand that felt like ice. She whispered that they were doing this because they loved me. I pulled away from her touch and looked at the blue-backed legal document. My father checked his gold watch and told me I had 24 hours to decide. If I didn't sign by noon tomorrow, the police would be at my door to take me away. They walked out of the apartment, with the confidence of people who had already won. I locked the door and slid the chain into place. My hands were finally shaking, but not from fear. I picked up my phone and dialed a number I had kept saved for emergencies. Eric's office was located in a converted bunker downtown, away from the prying eyes of the local socialites. He was my late husband's cousin and a forensic accountant with a mean streak. I told him I needed to see him immediately. He didn't ask questions, he just told me to bring my laptop. I grabbed my keys and the box of past due bills they sent. The office air was chilled and smelled of server racks and old coffee. Kelly, a retired judge with sharp eyes, sat at the head of the conference table. Eric, was already scrolling through a tablet, his face illuminated by a cold blue glow. He told me they had found the reason for the family's sudden desperation. It wasn't just typical overspending or the coastal house. Destiny had been frequenting an illegal gambling ring in Atlanta for over 2 years. Eric slid the tablet across the table to show me the ledger. Destiny's name appeared dozens of times next to staggering losses. She owed $400,000 to people who didn't use banks. My parents had signed the secret loans, using their own home as collateral. The lenders had given them 48 hours to pay or things would get violent. That was why they needed John's inheritance. They were drowning and intended to use me as their raft. Kelly opened a separate folder containing the draft of their court filing. They had prepared affidavits, claiming I had tried to destroy my own furniture. They even had fake emails where I supposedly threatened to hurt myself. It was a complete narrative designed to strip me of my rights and my money. I felt a surge of adrenaline as I realized they had committed felony perjury before a single judge had seen the documents. Their greed had made them sloppy. I looked at the judge and asked what our next move should be. Kelly smiled, but there was no warmth in the expression. She said that if they submitted those lies to the court, we could destroy them forever. We needed a sting to catch them in the act of accepting the money under false pretenses. I told her I would give them exactly what they wanted. I would pay the debt, but I would set the trap first. I sat in the cold blue glow of Eric's office. We drafted a plan that felt like an execution. My objective was simple: trigger the trap while appearing to surrender. The clock was ticking toward the noon deadline. Kelly explained that a direct payout would look like a gift. We needed it to look like a forced settlement. I pulled up the IRS whistleblower portal on my laptop. One click would flag every account my family owned for immediate federal review. The primary obstacle remained their leverage. They still held the forged psychiatric affidavits. If they filed them before my transfer, I would lose legal standing. I felt the pressure mounting in my chest like steam. Eric showed me how to link the illegal gambling ledger to their primary bank routing numbers. This connection was the key. It turned a family dispute into a federal racketeering case. My finger hovered over the enter key. I was ready to burn it down. A new detail emerged as we scanned Destiny's public social media feed. She was filming a live countdown to my supposed commitment. She was wearing a designer dress I had paid for last Christmas. Her followers were sending heart emojis and prayers for her grieving family. The irony was a bitter pill. She was using my pain to build a brand, while her lenders were likely watching the same stream. The power balance shifted as I realized her vanity. I recorded a video of myself calmly explaining the situation. I held up the morning newspaper to verify the date. This was my insurance against their claims of a mental break. I spoke clearly about the trust fund and the threats made by my parents. I sent the file to a secure cloud server managed by Kelly. If I disappeared into a facility, the video would go live to every news outlet in Georgia. I was finally playing their game. I returned to my apartment and waited for the morning light. The Savannah heat began to crawl through the window glass. I looked at the conservatorship papers sitting on my coffee table. They were stained with a ring from my coffee mug. I picked up a pen, but did not sign them yet. I needed them to see me defeated one last time. The phone rang at exactly 11 in the morning. It was my mother checking on her investment. "We are coming over now," Amber said with a voice like honeyed poison. She told me to have the papers ready. I told her I would do the right thing for the family. She hung up without saying goodbye. I logged into my bank and prepared the transfer of $450,000. This was the exact amount Destiny owed the loan sharks. It was also the exact amount needed to trigger a federal money laundering investigation. I waited. The Range Rover pulled into the fire lane at noon. I watched from the window as they straightened their clothes. They looked like they were attending a celebration. Destiny checked her makeup in the side mirror. My parents walked with a predatory grace toward my front door. I opened the deadbolt before they could knock. As they stepped inside, I noticed a black sedan idling at the end of the block. It was not a police car. My father entered first, his eyes scanning the room for the signed documents. He didn't look at my face or the dark circles under my eyes. Amber followed, smoothing her silk skirt with a practiced air of mourning. Destiny hovered in the doorway, her phone held low, but the camera lens pointed directly at me. The objective was to make them believe I had finally surrendered. The air in the kitchen felt charged with their greed and my silence. Andrew tapped the coffee table and demanded the signature. I felt the pressure of the hidden black sedan outside. Those men were likely the lenders waiting for their pound of flesh. I told my parents I would transfer the money, instead of signing the conservatorship. My mother's eyes widened with a predatory flash of triumph. She said that was a sensible start to my recovery. They didn't care about the legal control if the cash was already moving. I sat at the table and opened my banking app. My fingers hovered over the screen while they crowded around me like vultures. The mid-scene turn came when I realized they hadn't even checked if the loan sharks were still outside. They were too blinded by the seven-figure potential of John's trust. I initiated a transfer of $450,000. This amount would cover Destiny's debt, but flagged the transaction for federal review immediately. It was done. Destiny squealed and hugged her phone as the confirmation screen flashed. She didn't hug me. My father let out a long breath, his shoulders finally dropping from his ears. He told me I had done the right thing for the family name. I watched the progress bar on the screen reach 100%. The money was gone from my account. It was now sitting in their joint holding fund, glowing like a beacon for the IRS agents. I told them I needed to rest and asked them to leave. Amber kissed my cheek. Her skin smelling of expensive perfume and triumph. She promised they would check on me tomorrow morning. They walked toward the door, already whispering about the new house on the coast. I watched through the window as they reached the Range Rover. The black sedan at the end of the block suddenly pulled out. It followed them closely as they turned the corner. I picked up the phone and dialed the whistleblower hotline. I provided the transaction ID and the links to the illegal gambling ledger. Eric had already submitted the corroborating evidence from his secure server. The trap was fully operational. By tonight, their accounts would be frozen by a federal mandate. They had the money for exactly 10 minutes before it became a lead weight. I sat back in the chair and waited for the real storm to break. The apartment felt strangely light despite the growing shadows. I looked at the empty space where John used to play with his toy rockets. I had used his inheritance to buy my freedom and their destruction. A notification popped up on my laptop from the security feed at my parents' house. 2 men in dark suits were already standing on their porch. They weren't from the government. The loan sharks had arrived to collect a debt they couldn't access. I watched the grainy security feed on my laptop screen. The 2 men on my parents' porch were not moving with the frantic energy of federal agents. They stood with a terrifying, statuesque stillness that signaled professional violence. My objective was to witness the collapse without being pulled into the debris. The savanna humidity seemed to seep through the glass. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. I realized then that the transfer had been a dinner bell for the wolves. The primary obstacle shifted from legal threats to physical danger. If the loan sharks realized the money was frozen, they would come back to the source. My parents were inside their home, likely celebrating with expensive wine while the shadow on their porch lengthened. I reached for my phone to call Eric. My hands were slick with cold sweat. I needed to ensure the federal freeze was fully active before the confrontation escalated. One wrong move would lead the predators back to my door. The mid-scene turn arrived when a third man exited the black sedan. He carried a heavy, padded envelope and a specialized digital tablet. This was not a standard collection visit. They were prepared to bypass digital security in real time. I watched my father open the front door with a smile that quickly withered into a mask of pure terror. He tried to slam the door, but a heavy boot was already wedged into the frame. The power balance shifted toward the street. My phone buzzed with a frantic text from Destiny. She was hiding in the upstairs bathroom and begging for help. She claimed the men were demanding the banking login details immediately. I felt a flicker of the old guilt, but it was quickly extinguished by the memory of the Zillow link. They had ignored my son's burial to shop for mansions. Now they were facing the consequences of the debt that fueled their greed. I deleted the message without replying to her. The men entered the house with a brutal efficiency that suggested they had done this many times before. I could see the flickering lights of the living room reflecting off the windows. My mother appeared for a brief second, her hands flying to her face in a silent scream. I pulled up the IRS tracking portal on my second monitor. The status had changed from pending to restricted. The federal government had officially seized control of the accounts. The money was now a locked vault. I heard a loud crash through the audio feed of the security camera. It sounded like the porcelain vase I had bought them for their anniversary shattering against the floor. My father's voice rose in a high, thin wail that didn't sound human. He was trying to explain that the money was right there on the screen. He didn't understand that the red bar meant the assets were dead. The lenders were losing patience with his excuses. The tension was a wire. A new realization hit me as I watched the screen. My father was pointing toward the window, gesturing in the general direction of my apartment. He was trying to trade me for his own safety. He was telling them that the source of the wealth was just a few miles away. The betrayal was complete and expected. I stood up and moved away from the window. I needed to leave before they decided to verify his claims. I grabbed my car keys. I threw my botanical journals and John's favorite telescope into a duffel bag. I didn't need anything else from this life. The air in the apartment felt thin and recycled. I looked at the kitchen table where the conservatorship papers still sat. I picked up a lighter and watched the blue, backed pages catch fire. The smoke smelled like scorched chemicals and old lies. I dropped the burning mess into the sink and watched the flames die. The past was finally ash. I headed for the back exit to avoid the street, facing cameras. My old sedan roared to life in the darkened alleyway. I didn't turn on the headlights until I reached the main road. My eyes caught the reflection of a blue light in the distance. It was not the police, but the glow of a tablet from another idling car. The lenders had scouts positioned throughout the neighborhood. I took a sharp turn and headed toward the interstate. I was ghosting. I drove toward the mountains without looking back at the city lights. My phone continued to pulse with calls from Amber and Andrew. They were desperate, trapped between the federal government and the mob they had invited into their lives. I reached over and tossed the phone out of the passenger window at 70 miles per hour. It shattered against the asphalt, severing the last digital tether. I was no longer a useful daughter or a target. I was just Rose. The mountain air was thin and bit at my skin through the open window. My objective was to reach the Blue Ridge cabin before the IRS freeze became public news. The engine groaned as I climbed the winding switchbacks. I checked the rearview mirror every few minutes, half expecting to see the black sedan or flashing blue lights. The silence of the forest was a heavy contrast to the screaming digital chaos I left behind. I felt like a ghost haunting my own life. The primary obstacle was my own physical exhaustion. My eyes burned from salt and lack of sleep. I pulled over at a rest stop near the state line to splash cold water on my face. The bathroom mirror revealed a woman I barely recognized. My hair was matted with savanna humidity, and the black dress I had worn to the grave was wrinkled. I looked like a victim, but the fire in my chest told a different story. I was the architect of a masterpiece. Even if the final gallery was a courtroom, I kept moving. A mid-scene turn happened when I reached the cabin driveway. A dark SUV was already parked under the hemlocks. My heart stopped as I gripped the steering wheel. I expected the lenders, but a familiar figure stepped out into the moonlight. It was Kelly, the retired judge. She had bypassed the security gate using my emergency code. She held a thick leather briefcase and a thermos of coffee. She looked at my car and gave a sharp, knowing nod. The federal warrants were signed an hour ago, Kelly said as she led me inside. Her voice was steady and dry. She explained that the Internal Revenue Service had enough evidence to seize my parents' secondary properties. However, because the cabin was in my name alone, it remained an untouchable sanctuary. She had already filed the paperwork to move my son's remaining trust into a secure offshore foundation. My family could not touch a single penny now. Their hunt was officially over. We sat by the stone fireplace as the news broke on a small television. The local anchor reported on a major racketeering bust in Atlanta. Destiny's face flashed on the screen, caught in the harsh glare of a mugshot. She looked small and terrified, without her filters and ring lights. The report mentioned a prominent couple taken to custody for questioning regarding money laundering. My parents were finally being seen for who they truly were. The public mask had shattered. I asked Kelly if the loan sharks had been caught in the sweep. She shook her head and warned me that those men rarely disappear so easily. They had lost their primary leverage when the accounts were frozen by the feds. Parents would spend the next few years in a courtroom or a cell. Destiny was facing a decade of felony charges. The inheritance they craved was now the evidence that would bury them. I took a long sip of coffee. The micro twist came when Kelly handed me a small, sealed envelope. She said it was recovered from my father's desk during the initial raid. I opened it and found a life insurance policy I never knew existed. It wasn't for John. It was a policy my parents had taken out on me years ago. They had been betting on my failure for a very long time. They were waiting for me to break so they could collect the final payout. I stared at the document until the words blurred into gray lines. The depth of their betrayal had no bottom. They didn't just want John's money. They wanted the profit from my entire existence. I tossed the policy into the dying embers of the fireplace. I watched the paper curl and blacken until the signatures vanished into ash. I was no longer a commodity to be traded. I was a person with a future they could never touch. "What will you do now?" Kelly asked as the sun began to peek over the ridges. I looked out at the frost on the trees. I told her I would build something that lasted. I would use my reward money to fund the astronomy scholarship in John's name. He loved the stars because they were constant and bright. I wanted other children to have the chance to look up without fear. I was done looking down at the dirt. The final complication arrived with a soft chime from Kelly's tablet. A new message had bypassed the blot. It was a video file from an unknown number. I pressed play and saw my mother sitting in an interrogation room. She wasn't crying or screaming. She looked directly into the camera and whispered a single sentence. She said that I would always be her daughter. It felt like a threat from a dying monster. I closed the screen. I deleted the video and set the tablet face down on the pine table. The dawn light was pale, filtering through the hemlock branches like cold milk. My final objective was to finish the paperwork for the John Morgan Astronomy Scholarship. I needed to ensure that every cent of the insurance money was beyond the reach of the state. Kelly watched me as I signed my name with a heavy fountain pen. The ink felt permanent and right. My old life was gone. The primary obstacle remained the psychological tether my mother still tried to pull. Her video message echoed in the quiet cabin, a reminder of the intermittent reinforcement that once kept me trapped. I felt a momentary surge of nausea as I remembered the years I spent begging for her scraps. But the paper in front of me was a shield. By signing these documents, I was converting her greed into a legacy of light. I chose to be the author of my end. Scene turn arrived when a notification pinged on Kelly's secure laptop. The federal whistleblower reward had been approved and deposited into my private account. It was a staggering sum, far more than I expected for exposing the gambling ring. This money was untainted by John's death or my family's lies. It was the price of my courage and my cold strategy. I finally had the resources to move anywhere in the world. The power was entirely in my hands. I stood on the porch and watched the frost melt off the mountain laurels. The air was crisp, tasting of pine and high-altitude clarity. I thought about the savannah sun and the heavy weight of that lonely burial. I was no longer that woman standing by a small grave with a breaking heart. I was someone harder and more dangerous to those who mistook kindness for weakness. I had stopped carrying their burdens. I was finally walking toward my own horizon. I handed the final signed documents to Kelly. She tucked them into her briefcase and offered a rare, thin smile of approval. She told me the scholarship would launch by the end of the month. John's name would be associated with the stars, not a family scandal or a bank account. I felt a sense of peace that was almost physical in its intensity. The war was over. I had protected his memory and secured my own future at last. As Kelly drove away, I noticed a small, white lily growing near the cabin steps. It shouldn't have been blooming this late in the season. I knelt to touch its petals and felt a sharp, metallic sting on my finger. A thin wire was hidden in the soil, connected to a small sensor. My mother's message hadn't been a plea. It was a digital flare. The loan sharks had cloned her phone before the feds moved in, tracking the recipient of her final outbound message to this remote ridge. The house was no longer a secret. They were already here,